Hi, everyone. Today, I'm very excited to interview one of my heroes. I have been a fan of his work on the future self. In fact, I even did a Philippine version of one of his experiments. And I was so thrilled when I received an email from him when he read the article I wrote about the dangers of super filtering yourself. His research, which sits at the intersection of psychology and economics, examines the ways we can improve our long-term decisions. He has earned his PhD in psychology from Stanford University. Prior to that, he graduated as magna cum laude at Tufts University with a BA in psychology and English. He's now a professor of marketing, behavioral decision-making, and psychology at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. He is so committed to the work of helping us make better long-term decisions. And you should all get a copy of his freshly published book entitled Your Future Self: How to Make Tomorrow Better Today. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Hal Hershfield. Woohoo!
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Rose. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so you are now being watched by our viewers here in the Philippines. I wonder if you have any awareness of where the Philippines is.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, you do. And in your book,
very far away.
Yeah, very far away. You are very far away. It's all a matter of perspective, right?
Exactly. I was going to say it depends on where you sit.
Yeah. So I was just saying that there is a mention in your book of the Manila envelope. So at least I think that you have that a little bit of an awareness. Anyway, so Hal, congratulations on your new book. But
Thank you.
before we dive into that, would you like to tell us how you got into the field of behavioral science, behavioral economics, and what made you started? What fascinated you with the future self? Please give us a glimpse. Yeah, give us a glimpse of how you are as a young boy.
As a young boy. Well, I mean, to some extent, it comes back to, growing up, my parents are both psychologists.
Oh, yeah.
And the funny thing about that is that, when people ask me what I wanted to do when I grew up, I would say, like, well, all I know is that I don't want to be a psychologist because, I don't want to be exactly like them. I want to do my own thing. Of course, here I am, a psychologist, but I do, academic research. Now, along the way, when I was in graduate school, I was having a conversation with my academic advisor, and we were trying to figure out, what sort of pressing social issues are worth studying.
Mm-hmm.
And Laura Carstensen, that's her name, she's really an expert in policy decisions and aging and decision making. And she said, there's not enough attention being paid to retirement issues. And I said, what? Retirement? I was like in my mid-20s, and I was like, that sounds really kind of boring. And she was like, that's the problem. Somebody who's your age thinks it doesn't sound that exciting. And that conversation really got me to think about, well, why don't we think about the very long term when we're younger, and what's the sort of stumbling blocks there? And so a lot of it boils down to these, thoughts of our own selves over time, our future selves. And that really got me started down this path. So you really open up the can of worms there with all those questions, with that question.
So thanks to that conversation. So since you already delved on what you were thinking of in your 20s, can we backtrack a little bit even further? Could you share with us a childhood money memory?
So, it's funny because when I was a kid, oh gosh, I think I'm going to date myself here, but we had the...
Don't worry, I'm older than you.
Okay, fine. Well, then perfect. We had the actual encyclopedia in our house, not Wiki. Okay, you got... And when I was a kid, for whatever reason, I just loved the M book, looking at the the article on money. And I thought it was the coolest thing that there was different denominations of bills and which bills were in circulation and which weren't. And I collected coins. I'm not really painting like a picture of myself as like that cool of a kid. But anyway, that, that's a little different from a money memory per se. and thinking about like spending it or saving it or whatnot. But I was fascinated by the like
Fascinated.
currency and the what it meant. And like, at some point later in my life, I realized like, oh, it's so interesting to think about, these are just symbols, money, like what it actually stands for, and so on and so on. That's a whole other conversation. But that's kind of one of my first memories of money itself. And maybe that's different from what you're thinking about, but that's what I go to when I think of like money as a kid.
So it's a fascinating thing. That's what, as far as your childhood money memory is concerned, that is.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So can we now dive into your book and tell us about the MRI findings that shows how we look at our future selves?
Yeah, one of my early studies was concerned with trying to figure out, well, how do we even think of our future selves? One of the studies that I conducted, it jumped off of the observation that our brain can tell what's me and what's not me. And I sort of had this thought of like, well, if our future self is connected to us or not connected to us, what would happen when we think of our future self in the brain? And as it turns out, and I'm making this kind of sort of high level, but as it turns out, the brain activity that comes about when we think of our future selves looks more like the brain activity that comes about when we think of another person, which is really kind of a deep insight to say that on some level, our future selves seem like other people. It's a kind of an analogy, if you will.
So what you're saying is that you really had subjects and you were testing them, think about yourself, and then think about
Yes.
your future self. And then you were able to see the pattern. And the pattern was similar to those of the waves, so to speak, when they are thinking of strangers. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, that's right. So just to make it more specific, we had people come into the scanner, they would lay down, they see a screen above them, and on the screen it'll say a target person. So, your current self, your future self, another person, or another person in
Yeah.
the future. And then there would be words there, trait words, things like, energetic, friendly, shy, reticent, outgoing, these sorts of things. And you would click a button if it was yes, and click a button if it was no. But in clicking those buttons, what you're really doing is I'm thinking about myself. I'm thinking about another person. I'm thinking about my future self, and so on. And what we can do is watch after the fact. We can see, where was the sort of brain activity? Where did we see sort of, heightened activity in the brain when we're thinking about, say, ourselves now? And there's a part of the brain, we call it, cortical midline structures, the medial prefrontal cortex being one of them, the rostral anterior cingulate. These are all like parts of the brain that essentially have been implicated in coding thoughts about the self versus thoughts about another person. There's more activity when I think about myself in this part of the brain compared to when I think about, say, you or somebody else that I don't know. And a similar thing happens when I think of my future self. There's more activity when I think of myself right now,
Yeah.
and not as much when I think of my future self. And in fact, that activity from the future self looks more like the activity that comes about when I think of another person, someone I don't really know.
Yeah, yeah. So can you tell us about that Jerry Seinfeld joke that you mentioned in your book?
Yeah, sure. So in the book, part of what I talk about is how we do think of our future selves as if there are other people. Jerry Seinfeld has this great bit where he says, I never get enough sleep at night because I stay up late at night. Well, at that point, I'm night guy. This is like for me, it's like watching one more episode of, something on TV on Netflix, right? And so he says, well, what about getting up after 5 hours of sleep? That's not my problem. That's morning guy's problem, right? And it's such a funny thing because it's like that real separation. He says he comes up with this solution. He says the only thing that morning guy can do is to oversleep often enough so that day guy loses his job and then night guy has no money to go out anymore, which is like kind of this perfect way to put,
Yeah. So
it,
it was articulated in a joke that we really think
yeah,
of the future and the present as two separate entities. And
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
and this idea of different versions of ourselves. In your book, you narrate about Pedro, El Matador. Can you tell us about him and why you decided to include him in your book?
Yeah. So I'd come across my like guilty pleasure that I listen to this one true crime podcast every week. One of the episodes had spotlighted this guy called Pedro Filo. He was considered Brazil's maybe worst serial killer ever, which is like a crazy thing. But the interesting thing about this guy is that he went to he was caught when he was younger. He went to prison. He killed people while he was in prison. And at some point he had this moment where he decided to stop. And he said, if I can get out of solitary confinement, I'll never kill anybody. I'll never harm anybody again. And like, strangely, he ends up getting let out of prison after 35 years because of like a loophole in the law. Like they couldn't keep him in longer. And which is crazy, right? Because you think about,
all the things that he did. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what was interesting, and the reason that I thought of him was because his life does not look like a life where there's just like sort of one version of him. He had this earlier version where he was this hardened criminal, killing dozens of people, admittedly, all of whom were like bad guys. Like he was the inspiration for the TV show Dexter. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's about a serial killer who only kills other criminals.
Robin Hood of killers.
Say that again?
The Robin Hood of killers.
The Robin Hood of killers. There you go. I love that. But then later in life, he's this like works in a bottle plant factory. He exercises every day. He runs like a YouTube channel for at-risk youth. He's like, looks like a completely different person. And I was really fascinated by the idea that there could be almost separate selves over time. I managed to have a Skype interview with him.
Yeah, you were so brave.
And ask him, right? I mean, it was very funny, but ask him about this, and was nice enough to talk to me, to give me some of his time and talk to me via Skype. And, one of the things I asked him was like, do you think of yourself, how do you think of yourself over time? And he said, I think of myself as I'm disgusted by the person I once was. That's not even, I don't even recognize that person. Mm-hmm. Now, it's an extreme example, of course, right? But it's representative of the idea that there can be separate selves. And I was almost wanted to talk to him as an analogy of the idea that we could be separate over time, and that he's, I can't say if he's truly different or not. Mm-hmm. And in fact, as a sad footnote, like he was killed about 3 months ago. And he
was killed.
Yeah, but I don't know by whom, but the way in which it was done suggests it was somebody who had a grudge against him. And so it's interesting because I think on some levels he actually did change over time, but then it raises this question of whether or not the people from his past saw it as so. Yes. And I'm not so sure that they did, Yeah.
And of course, there's always revenge.
But it's interesting because, revenge suggests that I assume somebody is the same over time, right? Like you have to pay for your past.
Yeah. So they didn't buy it. They didn't buy that.
This could get, this is a deep, this could go, we could go into a deep direction here, but anyway, yeah.
Okay. So the different selves, you also had that discussion about, it's like having different office mates. Would you like to tell us about that?
I mean, the way that I think about selves over time, it's sort of like, we have many of us work with coworkers, we have an office place. There are people, we know who they exist. We know they're there. We know they work with us, but we don't really know them. And then there are people who are, very close to us. Yeah. We're, they're our best friends. They're good friends of ours. I like to think about the self as a collection of selves, sort of like an office workplace where there's many people doing many jobs, but spread out over time within oneself. And what's interesting about this is that just as I can be more or less connected to my coworkers, I can be more or less connected to my future self. And what I think is really fascinating about this is it suggests that, with more of a sense of connection, a strong sense of connection, I'll be likely to do things for that future self's benefit. Do things now that will benefit them later.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that it could be a good way to, let's just focus on the money part, on the retirement part, to really get to know more that future self, so that we get closer to it, so that we will have, we can really do something great for that person. We can sacrifice for the benefit of that person.
Yeah. And I think we'll talk about it, but, sometimes sacrifice is a hard word because it doesn't sound fun, and it's like, I don't want to do, that really doesn't sound like something I want to do. Right. But we'll talk about that, I'm sure. But that's generally speaking the right idea, I think. Yeah.
So, and you also spoke about time travel. I was wondering, did you watch Back to the Future back in the day?
Ages ago. Ages ago. What was that?
Years
30?
ago.
Oh my
Okay,
gosh, actually probably
so
more than that. Yeah. Yes.
yes. So
Yes.
why did you decide to use this format of a time travel?
Well, so much of what we're doing when we think about our future selves is traveling through time, albeit in our minds, not
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
DeLorean, right? And I think it's a really useful way to think about the ways that we think about ourselves, both in the future and in the past. And it also can highlight, some of the mistakes that we make. But I mean, I think in terms of analogies, that's just what helps me think through things. And mental time travel is what it's called, is a good way to consider, or a good way to, a good way to understand the
yeah.
mistakes that we sometimes make, as well as the things that we can do to do better.
Yes. So yeah, while we already have that cognitive power to be able to time travel, we might as well use it. So now tell
That's
us
right. That's right.
about your findings and how we could be your experiments. How could we put ourselves in a closer relationship with this future self so that we can do better for it, for him, for her?
Yeah. So in the book, I go through a number of different strategies. I'll spotlight a couple
Sure.
that works. The marketing professor in me, wants to say, well, you'll have to buy the book to find out more. But so one bucket of strategies is to try to make the future self closer, to try
Yes.
to draw that future self in so that we feel a greater sense of connection to them, in the same way that we feel a greater sense of connection with other people, the coworker we were talking about, the one who we really like, and
Yes.
we would sacrifice for them, right? So I've explored a variety of methods. One one is to make that future self more vivid, more emotional.
Mhm.
And one way to do that is through what's known as age progression technology, to literally show people what they look like in the future. Um, Now we've been exploring this over the years, and have found that people who are exposed to these images are a little bit more likely to want to save and actually save for the future in the financial space. Other folks have looked at this in the health space. A new paper came out looking at a visualization exercise for women in rural Kenya, finding that this sort of exercise helps them not only save money, but also take preventative health measures and chlorinate their water so that their kids don't get stomach issues. I know this is something, of course, Rose, that you've explored as well. The gist there is that it's not about the aged image per se, but rather we're trying to figure out how to make the future self more emotional, more vivid, more concrete, more like somebody I can think about and plan for, and to bring back sacrifice for, right? So I talk about a number of strategies in that bucket, bringing that future self closer, and then I have a couple of other sort of categories of strategies. If that would be good to talk about it as well.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So the other one other strategy is to essentially start where we came left off with this idea that of sacrifice, and start by recognizing that, like, any of these trade-off decisions between now and later, spending versus saving, eating healthy versus not, exercising not, the person who always sacrifices is me right now.
Yeah, the
Like,
person.
I'm always the one who's sacrificing. Future me is always the one who benefits, which is kind of not great. It's like a bad relationship where, like, I'm the one, it's
Like
like
a
I'm
one way one way.
exactly. It's like a one-way relationship. Exactly. So, we've been trying to figure out how can we make sacrifices, quote unquote sacrifices, feel easier to undertake, so I'm more likely to do them.
Mhm.
Um, my own research, one of my favorite examples of this, we worked with a fintech company, and we asked people if they wanted to sign up for a savings account, an automatic savings account. And some people were asked if they wanted to save $150 a month. And some were asked if they wanted to save something that was psychologically easier, an easier sacrifice, $5 a day. Now, they're the same, of course, right? But the $5 a day, it feels easier. that's called temporal reframing. And I talk about in the book other ways to figure out how to make these present day sacrifices feel a little bit easier so that I'm more likely to do the thing. And the third bucket is all about what some people call commitment devices or
Yes.
pre-commitment strategies. And the gist there is, what can we do to put some guardrails on our behavior? Now, other researchers, and I know other folks who you've had on your show have talked about this. I like to look at this through the lens of current and future selves, because it's current me who makes this decision, and then these future iterations of me who will essentially have to answer to this decision that I made. And so when it comes to these commitment devices, there's a tension between picking a punishment, if you will, that is strong enough to make sure I don't do a certain behavior, but not so strong that I don't adopt that strategy to begin with. Exactly.
Okay,
Yes.
so commitment devices. Can you also talk to us about the dear future me and its iteration, which is like you're already in the future and you're writing to your present self? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so there's a great website called Dear Future Me. And the beauty of this site is that I can write myself a letter, an email, and I can say, when do I want that to be emailed to me?
Yes.
And write that letter, and it'll get sent back to me. Now, what's cool about this is that I am now creating a conversation over time with myself, because not only am I writing to my future self, but eventually I'm gonna turn into my future self and get a letter back from my past self, who, not to be too crazy about it, but who was my present self, right? I mean, this is, what I like about this is that first off, it forces you to kind of think a little bit about the future. But the act of getting that letter back, I mean, that may be really powerful, because it could conjure up memories and feelings and emotions. Now, this is an open research topic. There's some research that shows that people really enjoy getting time capsules from the past. And part of the reason is because they remind us of our ordinary moments, not the extraordinary ones, but the ordinary ones, which are kind of the fabric of our lives.
And things that we may forget already.
And things that we might forget. Now, I mean, what we don't know, I don't know what are the actual impacts of writing these letters and then receiving them back in terms of our behavior and our value adjustments and whatnot. That's an open research question, and it's something I would love to investigate, but it's not known right now. But it's a great website, and it's great for sort of fostering these sorts of connections over time.
You know what I really also like is the slider that uses your face. The more you save, the sadder the present self is, but the happier the future self is. So it's really like you have to decide how to do that balance, right?
Yeah.
Because there are also hazards of doing things, it's overdoing, favoring the future self. You might end up like a Scrooge. Tell us about the FIRE, financial independence, retire early. Some of the experiences that were not as favorable.
Right. It's interesting, because our conversation has all been about, making the future brighter, et cetera. And you can overdo it. I focus on myopia, which is tunnel vision for the present. So we're ignoring the future. But there's this psychological error called hyperopia, where we're so focused on the future that we miss the present. And the irony there is that I may end up making things worse for my future self if I have only lived for the future, because now I haven't created these memories. I haven't spent my money. I haven't had the experiences, and so on and so on. Now, the FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early, the basic idea there is getting people to, well, essentially that, be free from like the constraints of traditional work and retire early. But the catch is that it requires an almost, I don't know, monk-like existence where you have to sort of cut back on everything. And so, if you were to cut your expenses down to 5% of what they are now and live on that, could you live the rest of your life on the savings that you have? I don't know, maybe. But what sort of life is that? Like, it's really interesting, because there are elements of this movement that I think are really quite smart. I think the idea of thinking carefully about our expenditures and like considering them and weighing them is a great idea. And I know there are people who are happy with this, and I think there are people who really have benefited from the program. And then there's other people who've been vocal online who say, I was financially independent, but we couldn't go to weddings because there's too much money, and like we could no longer eat out. And you start thinking about what are the little things that we do with our money that make us happier.
Yeah.
And so I think, there's a balance there. There's somewhere in between. And this is not to say that FIRE movement is wrong or anything. I don't want to come out saying that, but
yeah, of course.
It does
Just
suggest
pick what works for you.
Exactly. What does work for you, and what is the thing, what drives us? What's something that that we value in terms of the way that we spend our money and spend our time and our other resources as well.
Yes. So I'd like to paraphrase, or maybe I don't know if this is a direct quote from you. You said something like, "Don't forget to celebrate the present. If we only live for tomorrow, we may arrive at a future that's devoid of memories and experiences that make life worth living."
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's it.
Yeah.
This has been such a great conversation with you, Hal. I'm taking away time from your kids, so that's why I'm very grateful. My takeaway from your book is this: living our life is a delicate balance between giving in to our present self, who is well represented when it comes to decision making, and our future self, who is not represented. We need to be more in touch with that future self in order to make better long-term decisions. We owe it not just for ourselves, but also to humankind, because the things that we're doing now are affecting the environment and all that stuff, for the generations after us also. And we can use our middle self to help us make better overall decisions. And this is in the form of what we discussed earlier, commitment devices. So, sir, did I get the book correctly?
You got it right. That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Thanks for the summary, and thanks for this great conversation. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, so any parting words from you, Hal? And if you could leave some practical tips on how we can behave, given all the studies that you've made on the future self.
Yeah, sure. So, I think if I can sort of give parting words, one of them is to say, consider that there's a relationship here between who we are now and who will be in the future, just in the same way that there's a relationship between who we are now and the people that we love in our lives who are currently occupying it. And if I can be practical about it, or maybe just more direct about it, don't forget that we change over time, and don't forget that our future self isn't one stable entity, but they can also change. And if we think too much about one stable, concrete self and fail to recognize the fluidity and the changes, that may also be treating our future self unfairly. And so we should make sure to recognize change over time as well.
So what's your favorite tip when it comes to saving for our retirement?
Okay. My favorite tip for saving for retirement is, if you can make it automatic so that you don't have to think about it, make it automatic. And if you're having a hard time getting there, that's when it may make sense to have that conversation with your future self. Have that conversation, write a letter to your future self, write a letter back from your future self. Really think about how they will respond to your behaviors today. Hopefully that provides a little motivation to then set up the actual administrative tasks to set up an automatic savings account. Set it and then forget it, but make sure you keep increasing it as you get raises and as over time. Otherwise, it's not going to be enough.
Thank you. So everybody, get hold of the book, Your Future Self. And once you apply the tips, your future self will be very happy and thankful to you and to Hal. Thank you very much. I will definitely get in touch with you again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
My pleasure. This is great conversation. Thank you, Rose.
Yeah, thank you very much.